What you are about to hear is a lecture given to the Philosophy of Religion class at the CalPoly University in San Luis Obispo, California by Reed Anandadas Goswami on August 15, 1995.
We thought we might talk about Brahman, this word Brahman. Not just the word, but the idea, of course. We could say simply that Brahman in the Vedic literature and civilization means the absolute truth. Absolute meaning something which is beyond the relativities in time and space. For example, now we're at CalPoly, but the fact that this is CalPoly, or the fact that we are at CalPoly, is limited by time. Far in the past, or not even too long in the past, there was no college here. And in the future, of course, there won't be either, because things in this world are temporary. This whole planet, we might say, is temporary. So certainly there's a limitation of time. CalPoly is here, but it's not in Santa Barbara. It's just in this one city. So there are limitations of time and space. So if I say I am in CalPoly, that's a true statement. I can say that's a truth. Or that CalPoly is a university in San Luis Obispo. It's a truth, but it's not an absolute truth because of the limitations and many other limitations as well. So the idea which is expressed in the Upanishads are a philosophical body of literature. They're different Vedic literatures or scriptures, and the Upanishads are specifically those which deal with ultimate philosophy, spiritual philosophy. So in these Upanishads, we are taught that there is something called Brahman, which is the absolute truth. Something which is true everywhere and at all times, without any limitation. Or God. You could also say this means God. So, therefore, although sometimes you hear that in Hinduism, the Hindus worship many gods. Ultimately, this is not true, because there is certainly the idea, going back to the oldest literature, that there is one absolute truth, which is really worthy of our worship. In fact, the literatures that talk about worship of different gods really sort of I don't know, you'd call it sort of a cosmic Sears catalog. The idea is just to do commerce with different gods. There are different powerful people in the universe. For example, if you go to a university, that's not how you pronounce it, if you go to a university, then when you get out, you're supposed to get a job. So even before you get out of the university, these recruiters come on campus, and you can interview if you like, and try to appease the different gods of capitalism, or whatever, and try to get a position. So just as in this country, in any country, there are certain powerful individuals in business, in government, in academics, and so on. If you satisfy them and they're pleased with you, then they can offer you different material blessings, such as employment. You consider that a blessing. Anyway, so in the same way, as they say, as above, so below, or as below, so above. So just as in this world, we have to satisfy different authorities, teachers, government, capitalists, whatever, in order to get so-called good things of life. In the Vedic scriptures, there was the understanding that you'll also find in other ancient literatures that there are powerful personalities, not only on this planet, not only in your city or in your town or in your country, but there are powerful personalities in the universe as well, personalities that rule the universe. And these are called gods or demigods. They're not the supreme God, but they're just powerful persons in the universe, just like the president of CalPoly is not God, or even Bill Clinton is not God. Although don't tell him that. But. So in that way, these powerful personalities are sometimes worshipped. For example, they had a thing in the paper because Jerry Garcia just passed away, and they showed the very predictable photographs of people crying and so on. And there was even a band of nomadic people that would follow that band around, and constantly talk about what they said. They said this, they sang that, they did this, so-called deadheads. So the word worship, what is worship? In our Judeo-Christian tradition, if you actually declare someone to be the highest truth or God, and then you bow or do something and offer formal worship. We call that worship, but really we worship all kinds of things. We worship people by always talking about them, by glorifying them, writing about them, reading about them, following them around, paying money to see them, offering them gifts. There's a word in Sanskrit, puja, which is often translated worship. In India, or in Hinduism, whenever people go to temples and worship the gods and so on, this is called puja. But the word puja actually means not worship in the Judeo-Christian sense, that a type of honor that is reserved for the Supreme Being. It simply means to honor in general. So that if you read the Sanskrit literature, ancient literature, you find that when people meet, for example, let's say a respectable person comes to your house, a great sage or a king, then you honor that person. And the same word is used, puja. So to honor people is natural. We honor people in this country, often the wrong people. But still, honor is there. So if you read ancient Sanskrit literatures like the Vedas and so on, and it may give the impression of polytheism because this puja or honor is offered to this god, to that god. Again, we use the term God, not in the sense of a supreme being, just a very great personality that's got a lot more money and power than you do, and perhaps controls sunshine or thunder and rain or whatever. So anyway, despite this apparent polytheism of Hinduism, if you go to the philosophical literature, the Upanishads, and not the commercial literature, which deals with sacrifices to different gods to get material things, if you go to the philosophical literature, what we find unmistakably is that there's one God. There's one absolute truth, and this is called Brahman. So for those people in Vedic culture, I use Vedic because the literature, the original literature is called Veda or the Vedas, which means knowledge. This word means knowledge. So the sacred literature was simply called knowledge, and therefore we use the adjective Vedic. Actually, one interesting linguistic point, I won't get into this too much, but English is also held to be an Indo-European language. Sanskrit is, many people consider, the oldest language. And if you wanted to derive an adjective from this noun, Veda, in Sanskrit itself, the word would be Vaidika. And then in English, we derive adjectives actually in a similar way, saying Vedic. But anyway, you can see here how... that's just a little footnote. Because our language also comes originally from the same family of languages. Anyway, so in the philosophical literature, in the spiritual literature, which is explicitly going after God, going after the highest truth, the purpose is not just to get rain for your crops, not just to get sunshine, not just to appease some powerful material personalities, as we do by paying taxes and whatever. But when the goal is really religious and spiritual, then we find there's one God. And that's sometimes called Brahman. But there's also a certain misapprehension, because in that same Upanishadic literature, in the same philosophical or spiritual literature, there are also very intensely personal descriptions of God. There are descriptions of a personal God. So it's not an impersonal idea. There are actually two kinds of descriptions, which... so that's unreal. The word guna in Sanskrit means quality. This word means quality. And in the philosophical literature, it's used in the sense of God having or not having qualities, such as the quality of, let's say, having a body. Having a body would be called a quality, or having an individual personality, being an individual person, having individual senses so that you can see things in a way that no one else can see, or hear things in a unique way. These are all called qualities, or guna. Now, there has been a debate actually throughout world religions about whether God is ultimately a person or not a person. In fact, you find this was one of the earliest theological debates in Islam. There was a group called the Mu'tazila who gained prominence in the court at Baghdad, I guess around the 9th century or something of this era. And they were heavily influenced by Greek rationalism, and they thought they were pretty smart. So they reasoned their way to the conclusion that all of the descriptions in the Quran that claim that God is a person, right? For example, God sits on a throne. Same type of thing you find in the Bible. God sits on a throne. God extends his hand. God is a judge. He's a king. He sees. He hears. And so on. But all these personal descriptions were simply poetry, sentimentality, sort of a a scriptural strategy to attract pre-philosophical nerds that couldn't really understand heavy-duty, hardball rationalism. And so to attract these kinds of people, you had all these sentimental, poetic descriptions of God's a person, so that you could sort of hook people by anthropomorphism. Anyway, ultimately these people were defeated within the Islamic community. I forget the name of the Islamic theologian. Sorry, what is it?
Al-Ashari.
Yeah, Al-Ashari, exactly. But he ultimately was victorious in the sense that the Muslim community accepted him as having put forward better arguments, and they decided that the statements in the Quran weren't simply sentimental poetry, but actually they were real statements about God, and how God is a person perhaps they couldn't understand, but somehow those statements should be taken seriously. So similarly, in India, perhaps the central theological debate within Hinduism has been this point about God's personality. Now, the word guna means quality in the sense of personal qualities, perceptible, palpable qualities. To be a person, to have a body, to have a personality, to be able to perform personal activities, and so on. By the way, this debate you'll also find in Plato. We won't go into that now. Anyway, and also in Judaism, of course. Now, in Sanskrit, if you put this prefix before the word nir means without. So nirguna means that God has no such qualities. Ultimately, God is not a person. He's not an individual. He doesn't have a body. He doesn't perform personal activities. He doesn't have a personal consciousness. It's just some kind of radiant spiritual energy that's diffused everywhere, something like that, divine light or whatever. Now, the Sanskrit prefix sa means with. So saguna means with qualities. So these two words are even applied to an eraser. These two words are not applied to erasers, but anyway. So you have the idea of nirguna Brahman and then saguna Brahman. The idea being, does the absolute truth have these personal qualities or not? What is God ultimately? This is a very big debate. And by the way, one thing I should say, we're using the word Hinduism, and of course the word Hindu is related to the word India. The word Hindu is itself not a very good word. If you say Christian, at least the word Christian is obviously derived from the word Christ. So if you say Christian, it has a lot to do with the whole phenomenon of Jesus and the fact that he was perceived by his followers as being God's representative, the Christ, and so on. So it makes some sense. It makes a lot of sense, the word Christian. The word Hindu, however, is problematic because you have this river called the Sindhu River, which formerly was in India, but now, since the partition of India and Pakistan is now in Pakistan, it just roughly runs down through Pakistan, to the center of Pakistan. It's the major river there, the Sindhu River. But as I said, it used to be Indian. Anyway, historically, gradually a Persian civilization arose on the west side of this river. And on the east side of the river was still the Vedic civilization. Now, it so happens that the people on the west side, the Persians, pronounced an initial S like an H. Therefore, for example, one word, asura, which means a cosmic power, they pronounce this word asura as ahura. So you may learn in the Persian, if you ever study Persian religion, they have a god called Ahura Mazda. But actually this word ahura is the word asura. Anyway, the Persians pronounced this word Sindhu, Hindu. That's just how they pronounced it, and therefore the people on that side of the river were the Hindus. Just like you say the Oklahomans or the the Americans from America. So the people that way on the other side of the Sindhu River were called the Hindus. Just to complete this little picture of artificial words. If you keep going, the next door neighbor of India was Persia, and if you go one door down, you come to the Greek civilization. So the Greeks didn't pronounce an initial H, so this became Indu, or the Indus civilization, or finally India. Anyway, a rose is a rose. But what I mean to say here is that although this Vedic civilization really is the whole foundation, historically the whole basis of South Asian culture, especially in what is now India, The word Hindu itself doesn't really get at what the civilization is. It's an artificial word. It doesn't come from the literature. Hindu is not a Sanskrit word, by the way. And you won't find this word in Sanskrit scriptures. It's just a word that popped up. So how do you describe the religion of this region? One term which many people in India that know about the tradition itself feel comfortable with is this word Sanatana Dharma. Those are followers of Sanatana Dharma. The word Dharma, have you talked about the word Dharma?
Not here yet.
Not here yet? Many of you probably have heard this word Dharma. I'll just give you a very brief explanation of what the word Dharma. Dharma means, it's translated religion, or religious principles, sacred law, etc., etc. The word Dharma actually comes from a Sanskrit root. I won't go into the technicalities, which means that which sustains or holds. And so the word Dharma really means an essential characteristic which sustains the identity of something. For example, liquidity is a characteristic of water. If something isn't liquid, it ain't water. So you can't take liquidity away and still have water. It's an essential characteristic. It's a defining feature, something which I think in philosophy they talk about accidental and what's the opposite of accidental qualities? Essential qualities, intrinsic or inherent qualities. A quality which actually sustains the identity of something as that thing. So Dharma means the essential characteristic of a living being, of a person. And that essential characteristic is that a living being must serve, must follow some higher authority. And so all of us have rules to follow. For example, within this university, sitting here now, there's all kinds of wild behavior that we wouldn't really appreciate here. So even though it's not stated, it's understood, we all know what the rules are. There are, if you think about it, hundreds of different principles that we're following right now, just sitting here. Well, I'm not sitting, but anyway, just being here, there's all kinds of rules about what we should do, what we shouldn't do, what proper behavior is, what is the proper way to treat certain kinds of people, and so on. This is all Dharma, what our duties are. Anyway, so Sanatan, this word Sanatan means eternal. The idea being that you have duties based on your identity. For example, if you're an American, you have certain duties. If you're an American man, you have certain duties. Of course, nowadays all that's becoming merged, but the concept that certain duties are more for men, certain duties are more for women. Now, of course, the tendency is to say that all the duties are for everybody. We'll see what the results are of this social experiment. But anyway, children have certain duties. They're supposed to go to school. After a certain age, you don't have a duty to go to school. So there's all kinds of duties depending on what kind of body you have. But the idea of Sanatana Dharma is that there are certain duties which are for the soul. No matter what kind of body you have, there are certain duties, certain principles you should follow just because you're a person, you're a soul, just because you're part of God. And so this Sanatana Dharma, these eternal duties, are really what unite what is called the Hindu community or Hindu society. The word Hindu itself is kind of doesn't really say anything at all. But this allegiance to, this belief in eternal principles which pertain to the soul, which all living beings should follow, is really what unites the community. Now obviously certain principles, certain types of dharma are not eternal. For example, certain marriage rituals, or certain worship of gods to get money or to get health or longevity. Those things are not sanatana. So therefore, even though there's a vast variety of religious duties, and you can get into ethnography and go to villages and find out how the people dance and sing in different villages and regions, if anything holds the Hindu community together, it's this belief in eternal spiritual principles. And these spiritual principles, again, get back to Brahman, because these spiritual duties are duties toward God, toward the absolute truth. Anyway, so getting back to this thing now, is God a person or not? Is God a person or not? Is God just radiant energy? Is God a divine light? Is there a person? If God is a person, how could God be unlimited being a person? These, of course, are the standard philosophical issues. And to make a long story short, we, those of us who are worshippers of Krishna, by the way, Krishna for us is God, the same God, and usually that question comes up, same God worshipped by other religions. We don't have the idea that our God can beat up your God. Our idea is that there's one God. So anyway, we strongly advocate this position, that God is ultimately a person. And that God has somehow or other spiritual forms, spiritual activities, and that the impersonal Brahman is simply the energy of God, is simply the radiance of God, or the effulgence of the Supreme Lord, but that ultimately there is a personal God. That is our position. By the way, when I say our, one very ancient name of Krishna is Vishnu. Vishnu means something like the all-pervading Lord. And therefore those who worship Vishnu or Krishna are called Vaishnavas. Vaishnavas. So, I'll just throw out a few points then perhaps. This class goes to what time?
1:30.
Oh, to 1:30. Oh, good.
Funny.
Keep me out in the streets at least until 1:30. Okay, so I'd like to bring up a few points because generally the argument against a personal conception of God would be something like, in this world people are limited. We are persons, we have so many limitations, imperfections, so if God is also a person, then it stands to reason God would have those same imperfections and limitations. But that's not what we mean by God's an imperfect, limited being. Therefore, God is not a person like we are. And besides that, everyone knows that's just anthropomorphism, that we are projecting out from ourselves the very features we have, projecting them onto a God who is not like us, etc., etc. These are the standard arguments that you hear if you enroll in an American university. Usually, your first semester on campus, you'll be assaulted with all these. Anyway, so the point I would like to make is that these are ultimately not good arguments. They sound good until you get down to serious philosophy and really examine the philosophical issues. Until that point, these sound like good arguments. So, where to begin? Well, first the limitations of God. That God would be limited if he were a person. God is not limited, hence God is not a person. Why is this a bad argument? Well, first of all, to give a little background, in the Bhagavad Gita, this is our main text. This, you may have heard of this Bhagavad Gita. It was the favorite book of such famous people as Mahatma Gandhi and Henry David Thoreau at Walden Pond read this book every day. And he said, and I quote, if you accept Henry David Thoreau as an authority, "In the morning I bathe my intellect in the stupendous and cosmogonal philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, in comparison with which our modern world and its literature seem puny and trivial." And Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "I owed a magnificent day to the Bhagavad Gita. It was the first of books. It was as if an empire spoke to us, nothing small or unworthy, but large, serene, consistent, the voice of an old intelligence, which in another age and climate had pondered and thus disposed of the same questions which exercise us." So those are some famous Americans in their comments on the Gita. Anyway, in the Gita, in the very beginning, Krishna, without going into the history, historical context, Krishna makes the philosophical point that we are not the material body. We are eternal spiritual beings. That's the first basic point. Arjuna, Krishna's friend, Arjuna was lamenting because he had to take part in a battle. And Krishna chastised him for growing weak-hearted. He used the word weak-hearted actually in Sanskrit, or Bali, weak-heartedness, and said that he should fight the battle. This does not mean that Krishna was just a bloodthirsty, primitive pagan god that wanted to see people killing each other. The point is that in the whole historical context, I said I wouldn't go into this, so I'll go very briefly. The Bhagavad Gita takes place within the context of the Mahabharata, which is a great epic history of South Asia and other parts of the world. In that history, we find that 5,000 years ago, there was a type of coup d'etat and illicit usurping of the government by some people who, by any reasonable person's standards, would be considered evil. They were evil people. They were murderers, basically, and they violated the constitution of that day. There was a constitution in those days, by the way. It was a constitutional monarchy. They violated the constitution. They attempted to murder the legitimate leaders of the government. They attempted to seize the government themselves. They did seize the government. And therefore, to reestablish constitution. Again, the word dharma means constitutional principles. It means all these things. But anyway, to reestablish the constitutional principles of that society, there was a battle. And the good guys won. And just before the battle began, Krishna spoke the Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna, who was the hero of the battle and Krishna's very good friend, dear friend and devotee. That's the historical context. So, using, so to speak, as a pretext, the fact that Arjuna was lamenting for the imminent death of his relatives, because these were royal warriors, people from a royal dynasty, and as you know from European history, there's not that much royalty to go around, so usually the royalty is all related to each other, because they marry within that royal dimension, and therefore royalty generally tends to be related. They're all relatives. So therefore Arjuna had to kill his own relatives in the battle, although they were also warriors. They weren't draftees or people that got dragged onto the battlefield as cannon fodder or, I don't know, arrow fodder. The idea was that they were all warriors. They all came to fight. In fact, Arjuna says in the Bhagavad Gita that everyone in the battlefield wants to fight. The very first verse of the Gita, actually. Dharma kshetre, kuru kshetre, samaveta yuyutsava. That all the people there, yuyutsava, they wanted to fight. They were warriors. And of course, they're all related. Many of them were related. So Arjuna didn't want to fight, which Krishna didn't appreciate. After all, imagine if there was a coup d'etat in America. Imagine if some evil power just took over the government one day, and when they called the military out to reestablish a legitimate government, the soldiers said, well, I don't want to fight because, we don't want to fight because, we might hurt someone. So better we just let the government be taken over, we can all live under a dictatorship and there's no problem. Most of us probably wouldn't appreciate that. If we lost our freedom, we lost constitutional government because the military people thought that, love and peace was more important than defending the Constitution. Most people wouldn't appreciate it. Krishna didn't appreciate it. And anyway, in that situation, he told Arjuna that anyway, we're not the body. The body is not the person anyway. You're not killing anyone because everyone is an eternal soul. And the Bhagavad Gita begins on that note. Anyway, the relevant point here is Krishna has already explained in the Bhagavad Gita that even we are not material. Even we are eternal spiritual persons. So how can the personal form of Krishna itself be material? That's the first philosophical argument. If we say that if God were a person who would somehow be mundane, then implicit is the argument that personality itself is material. It is of the very nature of being a person, of having an individual consciousness, that it is mundane or limited. Now, if you think about it, would you rather be a rock? In other words, the fact that you're a person, the fact that you have individual consciousness, as opposed to, let's say, being a stone or just a clod of earth, would you be more unlimited? Would you be somehow greater as a person if you were, or greater as a being if you were not a person? Or take evolution. If you consider the evolution of species, not speaking now in a Darwinian sense, but simply the hierarchy of being. If you consider, let's say, amoebas, then reptiles, maybe birds, or plants, mammals, ourselves, is it that the more advanced beings are more personal or less personal? Is it that by our greater personality, our greater amount of individual consciousness, are we more limited than amoebas who have less individual or personal consciousness, less personality than we do? In other words, is it actually a fact that mere energy, which is not personal, is intrinsically, simply because it is not personal, somehow greater than we are? Anyway, obviously the answer is no. These are sort of obviously rhetorical questions. The point being that as personality develops, as personal individual consciousness develops, we gain more powers, more awareness, we become greater as beings. So therefore, if you project this tendency philosophically, imagine a being who has an infinite personality. What is the sense in which that being would be limited simply because it was personal? In other words, what is there of the nature of being personal that makes one limited? Rather, it seems to be a liberating the liberating phenomenon to become a person, to develop individual consciousness. Are there any questions on this? I don't want to lose everybody, but yes.
Is it a person as in like an actual physical body? Or like, you know, when Christianity, like Jesus came down in a like body, but then there's also personal attributes of God in heaven. So now, where is Krishna? And does he look like something, or?
Yeah. Actually, here's a picture. This is a picture of the battlefield. Picture's worth 1,000 words. This is Krishna driving Arjuna's chariot. It's a very famous scene. Now, here's the difference between Christian theology and this Krishna theology. As far as I've understood Christian theology, as far as I've studied it, it seemed that, actually not so much Christ himself, but the later followers seemed to feel it's very important to convince everyone that Christ really was in the flesh and that he was really suffered because he was in the flesh, and don't think he didn't suffer, and don't think he wasn't in the flesh. This became if you study the history of development of Christian theology. However, in the Vaishnava theology, the idea is that even though Krishna came as a visible person, a historical visible person, that his body was actually spiritual, not material. And now, the idea being that spirit is not in and of itself invisible, it's not intangible, it's just that it's a superior energy. And the reason we cannot see spirit or hear spirit is simply because our consciousness is covered. Just like if a person's blind and cannot see the physical world, doesn't mean the physical world is not visible. It just means that person lacks the equipment or lacks the power to see. So the idea is that matter, this matter, like this table, things that you can touch and hear and see and smell and so on, are simply a perverted reflection of spiritual substance. There is spiritual substance. The soul is something, or spirit is something which is substantial, but it's of a greater quality, a more subtle quality. Krishna says in the Gita, Sukshmatva Tadabhigayam, that the spirit cannot be understood by people in general because of its subtlety. But that if you purify your senses, if you purify your consciousness, then you can actually perceive it. But that sometimes when God comes down to this world, there you have the word, Sanskrit word avatar. In America they say avatar. Anyway, ava, this word ava means downward and tar means crossing, so one who crosses down into this world is called an avatar. So the idea is that God, out of his causeless mercy, sometimes comes down into this world and becomes visible even to human beings, trying to save them, trying to redeem them. So even though a body is visible to us, doesn't mean it's necessarily material. Although normally we would expect that to be the case.
So he comes down like every so often or something?
Yes. Yeah, there's a whole schedule given in the scriptures. These are the incarnations of the avatars. Krishna, by the way, is considered by those who worship him as the origin of the avatars, not just an incarnation of God, but it's actually the origin. This you find in the Srimad Bhagavatam also. Krishna is too Bhagavan Swayam.
If I could just
Sure.
ask you about that. There are 10 avatars of Vishnu in some of the writings
Right.
that I have read, and Krishna is the 8th, but they're all the same divine being.
Exactly.
Is that also what you believe?
Yeah, these actually, the literature says that the incarnations are asankhyeya, literally innumerable, but there are 10 very famous ones. And so to facilitate the meditation of the devotees, these 10 are often talked about, the Dashavatars.
Like the poem by Jayadeva.
Well, in the poem by Jayadeva, actually, Krishna is not mentioned, interestingly, as one of the avatars. The first one is fish. It said that Krishna came as actually a cosmic fish. That he came then as a tortoise, as a boar, as Nrsimhadev, half man, half lion, as a beautiful dwarf Brahmana, Vamana, and so on. But actually Krishna, interestingly, is not mentioned as one of the avatars. Rather, the Gita Govinda, to which this hymn is a prelude, talks about Krishna as God himself. So you find that in Jayadeva also, and also in the Srimad Bhagavatam, the same idea that Krishna is actually the avatari, or the source, the origin of the incarnations. So now, if God is everywhere, if God is all-pervading, and if God is eternal, in what sense would he be limited even if he were a person? You can say that, will God be limited because, well, how would he be limited? Maybe someone could give an idea. I mean, how would, if God were a person, in what sense would he be limited if he were all-pervading and eternal? Even if he were a person, even if he had a spiritual form. As we read about, for example, in the Bible, or the Quran, or the Bhagavad Gita, that God has a form. What would be the limitation of God? Yes.
Well, he's on the chariot, he's not off the chariot.
But we said all-pervading, so you have to take the condition, the term seriously.
Does he have to keep promises?
Keep promises?
This is something that Sir Peter Keats writes
That's a little
about
bit.
in one of his views of God, that God is limited insofar as he has set moral limitations. And
That's an interesting point.
Yeah.
Krishna may not. Krishna is known sometimes for being mischievous. He may not, but he'll always do what is good. Socrates raised this point. What's the name of that thing? The Euthyphro. Socrates says that it is something good because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it is good? And so, if you say that God has to keep promises, there's a difference between saying that it is the nature of God that he loves virtue, he loves goodness, and we could just define good as being that which is beneficial. That which is beneficial. Good is that which does good, which brings about a good effect in others, or even God himself. So, to say that God must follow this principle or that principle, of course, we wouldn't accept. Because who will compel God? There's no higher authority to obligate him. And yet it's the very nature of God that he is good. But anyway, so I would argue God is not limited simply because he's personal. And secondly, this argument of anthropomorphism, I think, is a bogus argument. I'll explain why I think it's a bad argument. First of all, the first appearance that I know of this argument that if you say God's a person, you're projecting your own internal state, appears in a pre-Socratic philosopher called Xenophanes. Anyway, Xenophanes says that, well, if you look around the world, you see that everyone draws pictures of their gods and pictures that resemble themselves. Like he says, that Greek people or Thracians or Egyptians, if you look at all the pictures of the gods they draw, God looks suspiciously in his features like those people. And God wears clothes like those people and so on. So obviously he said that it's just a projection. He said that if animals, things that if lions or horses could draw pictures of gods, then you'd see God looking like lions or horses. Anyway, he made this argument. Now, first of all, I would argue against Xenophanes that we don't find lions and horses generally worshiping God. And it does seem to be, at least on this planet, a unique prerogative of human beings to worship God. So there is a sense in which human beings have some type of connection to God that horses and lions don't have. You may say they're also creatures of God. They're connected, you could say, ontologically, metaphysically, being part of God. But in terms of consciousness, in terms of conscious relationships where there's mutuality, where two people are conscious of each other, there's a way in which human beings have access to, are connected to God that animals aren't. So there is something about human life which is closer to God. If not the soul, you could say the soul in the horse is ultimately just as divine as we are, but the body itself somehow has more to do with God, this type of human body. So the first argument about lions and horses, I think, is ultimately unreal because lions and horses don't draw pictures of God. Second thing is that in terms of psychological projection, there are different ways you can conceive of it. I would say you could talk about a radical projection, and by radical projection I mean there's actually nothing at all out there, you just imagine it, which I think is very unlikely. Then we're talking about real pathology, real insanity, where there's actually nothing out there at all, zero. But you think something like Harvey the Rabbit, you think there's some big rabbit hovering above you or something, and no one else can see it. Now even then, even take some fantastic case where some mentally ill person thinks that there's a gigantic rabbit that follows that person around. Now first of all, in this case, this is clear pathology. We'd expect to see other symptoms of mental illness as well. And second of all, there are real rabbits. Maybe not the one he sees, but there are real rabbits. So even that projection is not totally detached from reality. But in any case, you would basically have to say that most people that ever lived were insane, and not simply in the sometimes philosophical, poetic way we say the world's crazy, but I mean really clinically insane. Most people that ever lived in this world were clinically insane, because most people that ever lived had some idea of a personal God. And this is true for Buddhism as well as Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism. If you actually study, it's not the one-hand clapping stuff that really made it big in the Far East. It was actually a type of Buddhism in which there are personal deities, bodhisattvas. People really feel they're getting into touch with a personal savior, as in Pure Land Buddhism. So therefore, if you study all the religions of the world, and by the way, civilizations whose ultimate principles are religious, generally, both time-wise and geographically, outnumber those whose ultimate principles are purely material. Most civilizations at most times in history had, at least nominally, their highest principles were something to do with religion and something to do with a personal object of religious faith. So therefore, we can just say that most of the people that ever lived were clinically insane and imagining something which didn't even exist. Or, what I think is a much more plausible, and by the way, by coincidence, these insane people produced probably the greatest works of architecture, literature, music, and produced all kinds of, prosperous, flourishing societies, even though they're all clinically insane, until finally we produced a few sane people who became atheistic humanists, and who are now trying to save the world with nuclear energy. Anyway, if you believe that, that's all right. I don't think it's plausible. So there's another kind of projection. There's another kind of projection in which let's say this is the object here. There's a real object out there, but you have different observers around this object, and they are perceiving it in different ways. And what you have, this is true even if you talk to 10 people that saw an accident on the road. You get 10 different versions of the accident. Or you can take something like, Mount Fujiyama, in Japan, and get 10 different paintings of it. You can get 10 different landscapes of Southern California. They're all different. Each artist has interpreted that landscape in their own way. But there really is something out there, and therefore you can identify, you can glean from all these different perspectives certain universal features so that you know this is the same mountain, this is the same landscape, it's the same region. You can get different portraits of a person, and they're all different, but you can see the similarities. You can gradually understand this is all about the same person, the same object, the same scene. Now this is a case of projection also, but it's not a case of creating something that doesn't exist. It's a question of different interpretations according to the limitations of our consciousness. So if you want to say that the idea of a personal God is simply a projection of consciousness, you would have to argue it in a radical sense. There's nothing at all out there. There is no personal God. And therefore, most of the people that ever lived were insane, even though they produced, fantastic civilizations. And there's nothing out there at all. Or you could argue that there is something out there. The very fact that you do find different pictures of personal gods throughout world religions proves there is something out there, but people are seeing it from their own perspectives. And now the issue is to get at the objective reality of it. What is that object which people think they're perceiving all around the world at different times from different perspectives? Did you have a question?
Well, it's not necessarily insanity. It could just be wishful thinking.
Okay.
Human standpoint.
Okay, but let's say, for example, you wish to become famous. To give an example. Now, let's say your desire becomes so strong, or something kind of goes wrong inside, and you think you are very famous, even if you're not. At that point, you've got a mental problem. Wishful thinking is fine if it really is a wish, but if you think that your wish is sufficient to establish the state of affairs out in the world, like, I'll give you an example of wishful thinking, a tragic example, but around 1971, in Toronto, the government was having so much trouble with hippies and LSD and all that, and drug trafficking. They decided that, let's put all these people in one place, maybe we can get a handle on it. So they built this very nice building in Toronto, where they always build nice buildings, and it was sort of like a 20-story college dormitory, something like that. Very nice, actually. Very nice standard. And they gave free residence in this very nice modern building to all the drug people. hippies in the city. Anyway, it was a disaster because it got taken over by drug mafia, and anyway, a big mess. But to make a long story short, at one point there was this group of LSD proponents or whatever that took a lot of LSD. I guess, I don't know, 5, 8 people, young men and women, and they suddenly all got the realization that they were now birds, or at least they had the powers of birds, they could fly. So they went to the 20th story and all jumped off the building. And of course, they weren't birds. They were humans, and they all died. So this is an example of wishful thinking. So, anyway, I think you get the point. Yes?
I guess the same thing you're just saying, but it just seems like what you're saying is, if you believe that, if you're trying to argue the anthropomorph, I can't even say it, that argument that there can't be a personal God, because if you believe there's a personal God, if you truly believe, then you would also have to believe that that person is the same, right? That's what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that if we deny there's a personal God,
That's what you're saying?
no, I'm saying that if we deny there's a personal God, if we say there is no personal God, then because so many people historically have believed there was, we would have to say they were crazy. Because the people that believe in a personal God.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah. Right. Because I'm saying, if you think something's there and it's not there, you've got a problem.
Well, Freud seems to think that in the future of an illusion, but I mean, he regards the belief as, in some sense, useful, although he thinks people will grow out of it.
Yeah, I would say that, right, I think what history has shown is that people that sincerely believe in a personal God and have some measure of sincerity, generally psychologically are much healthier than Freud, or the people that follow Freud. I mean, we all know that, who has the highest suicide rate among professionals, it's anyway, so if the truth is what works, I think people that have, in any tradition, Christian or Jewish or whatever, people that have a sincere belief in a personal God seem to do better psychologically than Freud did. Not to anyone. That doesn't, even if you say I proved it to myself, but to myself is a perfectly acceptable indirect object phrase. So it's the very nature of the word to prove that it requires a direct and indirect object. So therefore, you prove things to people, conscious observers who evaluate the proof, even if you're trying to prove it to yourself. Therefore, it's the very nature of proof that someone has to say, yes, I believe that you proved it, no matter what the kind of proof is. So therefore, we cannot certainly reject human testimony as relevant, because if we categorically rejected human testimony as a criterion of proving, then there would be no such thing as proof of anything to anyone. So there is, now you may want to set certain standards, like, okay, you have to prove things to people, but there are certain standards. You have to fulfill those standards. But again, those standards are established by people. And so, and the standards sometimes change. So, I guess I would say this. I mean, obviously you're right. It doesn't, you could say that the fact that most people probably in history that ever lived on the earth thought there was some kind of personal God or gods, whatever, some type of personal divinity. Most human beings that ever lived. That itself is not, it's certainly not a deductive proof. It's not an analytic proof of anything. But at the same time,
nor is it something that I don't think we know is true.
I think historically, if you study world civilizations, it really looks that way.
But do we know? I don't think we know everything. I don't think we know even the majority of human. By you studying civilized people, do we even know the majority of the?
Even if you, certainly historical civilizations, the ones we can study, I think it's definitely true. And even if you look at the artifacts of prehistorical civilizations, it really looks suspiciously like they had a lot of religious icons and things like that. Totally.
Some of the matriarchal, seems to be a lot of matriarchal,
sure,
very early civilizations.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, that fits very nicely within the same argument that You can be a divine mother. There's no problem with that. But still, there's some type of personal divinity. Mothers are, the most personal in your life. So anyway, so my point is that exactly how we want to utilize that fact that most people, or huge numbers of people, have believed in some type of personal divine existence. All I'm saying for now is that you cannot say, just out of hand, prima facie, that's not relevant. Because if that's not relevant, I would ask on what grounds isn't it? Now, even if I say, okay, maybe it's not the final argument, but you certainly can't say it's not relevant. You'd have to show why it's not relevant, that such large numbers of also intelligent people say that they have perceived something. And if the claim by large numbers of intelligent people they have perceived something is irrelevant, then I'd say the very notion of proof will become very wobbly. And it's going to be very unclear if anything can be proved anyway.
In math, they call it proof by exhaustion.
Proof by exhaustion. What's that?
I think that is a stronger argument. I'd be more willing to think that, that Krishna and Buddha and Zoroaster and Osiris and Confucius sort of point to a divine reality. I'd be more willing to listen to them and what they have to say than the idea of most people. And maybe it's just my prejudicial philosophical upbringing.
Are you saying that most people see God? I mean, if you look at through history, the only people who have actually seen God or talked to God are prophets, or who have had a very, very close physical encounter. And if you look at that number of people, you're down to a handful, and you can pretty easily say a handful.
Well, but you see, evidence doesn't at all rely just on seeing with the naked eye. For example, I took an astronomy course at UCLA. And one of the first things they told us, they were trying to shock us out of our stereotype or understanding of astronomers, is that I remember they said if an astronomer faced the prospect of being left on a desert island or whatever, or even a tropical island, but he was going to be isolated from the rest of the world, and he could only take one thing with him, what would he take? And they said most people think that he'd taken a telescope, but no. He would take a computer, because now, in fact, modern astronomy is very little of it's based on naked eye observation, even through lenses. It's really based on computer analysis, mathematical analysis of light, different light waves, and all that stuff. So that even in modern astronomy, most of it doesn't have to do with observation. Yet they don't doubt for a minute that they're talking about real things out there. So somehow or other, of course, seeing is very prominent as a sense, but somehow or other people at a very serious level have felt that they have perceived the presence of a personal divine being. We'll leave it open, say a mother, this, that, whatever. But some type of personal God. And people usually are not shy about using that word either. So some kind of personal God or goddess. Now they feel they have good enough evidence of the presence of that being. As you said, they may not claim that I have seen the truth, although sometimes they do, but still, they feel they have good enough evidence. And if there is a God, something like God, and as it says in the Bhagavad Gita, God is in the heart, and God can communicate with us, then if God, let's say in this scenario, if God chooses to make his existence known to a worshiper, and actually does that, actually does make his existence known to a worshiper, or her existence in the case of a goddess, then in that case, there's been a successful communication of knowledge. And the fact that that knowledge did not take place at a quote-unquote empirical level doesn't make the knowledge any less valid, because to say that well, it has to be brought out into the empirical arena itself involves you in philosophical silliness. Because, if you say that this was the death of logical positivism, at least among, I think, sane people, that if you say in order to demonstrate things you have to show them empirically, then of course you can't demonstrate that statement empirically. So if only things that are empirically demonstrated can be certified as true, that statement is the first thing that's going to go, because it can't be empirical. You can't show empirically that you have to show things empirically. So philosophically, it's just a bunch of silliness. And why? And who will impose that rule? By what authority does someone impose the rule that God must come out, and dance here on this table. God must, sort of go to the nearest university laboratory and report to the university scientists and get certified. It seems like that's against the whole spirit of religion, any serious religion. That God is independent, God is transcendental, God can do things in His own way, God does not reveal Himself to the non-believers. I mean, that's really at the core of religion in general. So I don't think that if people are satisfied that they have experienced a God, I don't think that the naked eye seeing is really going to be crucial. Yes.
But then if our consciousness is covered or veiled, and we get these pangs from our heart or our soul that says, love one another, fight evil, how do we know at what point we're with Brahman or with God or with any of the Almighty truth? Because we're in this veil, or this darkness with our consciousness, and is there just some big cosmic light show that comes on and says, ding ding, you did it? Because we still have war, we still have...
Well, didn't Jesus say that seek and you shall find, knock and the door will be opened, I think? Isn't that Jesus? Is that right? I think Jesus said that, huh?
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that's the basic point, that if the principle in the Bhagavad Gita is, Krishna states, is that God reciprocates with us. So if we approach God personally, He will personally reciprocate with that. And if we want to think that God is impersonal, then He will, so to speak, be impersonal for us. Because there's a principle of reciprocation.
So that the consciousness is raised from the darkness to the light,
Yes.
and just certain aspects, not at one rate.
Well, also, it's like the sun rising. When the sun rises, everything gradually becomes illumined at once. Krishna even uses this term in the Bhagavad Gita, Aditya Vajnanam, which in Sanskrit means sun-like knowledge. So that on the analogy of the sun, everything becomes illumined at once and gradually. So, actually, to answer your question perhaps more directly, according to the scriptures that we accept, in this particular age, which as you correctly said is veiled, to say the least, then in this age the most powerful means of reviving our love of God, our understanding of God, is by chanting the names of God. And it's not sectarian. I mean, according to this understanding, you can chant any names of God you like, any names that you feel comfortable with. But this principle of chanting the names of God is said to be a means to actually cleanse the consciousness, to purify consciousness. Because we talk about the environment, ecology, and pollution, but the real problem is that consciousness is polluted. And that's where the rest of the pollution comes from. So we need a cleanup of consciousness. And it said in this age, the way to purify consciousness itself, and not just water or air or rainforest, the way to purify consciousness is by bringing consciousness into contact with the secret cleansing agent, which is God Himself through His name, because the idea is that God is present in His name. In the Christian culture, they talk about the holy name of God. So why is God's name holy, unless somehow God is present in His name? In the Judeo-Christian tradition, I once wrote a paper actually at UCLA on the temple in Jerusalem, the original temple in Jerusalem. And one thing I found very interesting theologically in the Old Testament is that again and again and again, I mean dozens of times, it's stated there that the temple, the original temple in Jerusalem, was built as a temple to the name of God. That God would dwell in that temple as His name. It's the name of God that would dwell in the temple. And this is repeated dozens of times. When they dedicate the temple, for example, Solomon has an inauguration ceremony, and he says to God, I built this for your name, your name will dwell here. And there's a whole theology of the name of God, which I think has not really been talked about enough in the Bible. Old and New Testament, by the way, but there's a lot of talk in the Old New Testament about the importance of God's name. And we also feel that in this age, it's through God's name, the actual sound, which is spiritual, not material, though we may perceive it materially, is a key to cleansing consciousness, and it's not a sectarian process.
So is the perspective then that the important thing here is a belief in God, and Krishna is just as good as Jesus, is just as good as God, is just as good as, whatever you call it. It's not necessarily that as long as you're viewing the proper thing, does it matter from a perspective, or is it the view that you have to come via
We would say that Krishna is God the Father and that Jesus is the Son of God. We feel that God has different names based on different qualities. Like, for example, even in the Judeo-Christian tradition, you can call God the Almighty, the Supreme Lord, the Supreme King. And there are different names of God based on his different qualities and activities. The merciful, whatever. So, in that way, we feel that the qualities, let's say the word Krishna, that name Krishna, is a name which expresses all of the attractive features of God. That's actually what the word means. There's a Sanskrit root, krish, which means to attract. There's very interesting linguistic things here, but I won't go into them because I'll really put everyone to sleep. But anyway, this word krish means to attract. And so then you get the word Krishna, and that which, all attractive. Krishna actually means all attractive. So the idea is that when Krishna came to this world, he was considered most beautiful person, strongest person, most intelligent, wisest, and so on. Just as Jesus is glorified by different qualities. He was very merciful, he was compassionate, he was tolerant, he was forgiving, he was always doing the will of God, and so on. So that way, or the word Christ. The word Christ is the name of the Son of God, which specifically points to certain features, like, for example, being a savior, or coming, within history and changing the course of human life or religious life back toward God, or turning it back toward whatever. So the word Krishna also specifically means God who is all attractive. So specifically because in this age we're very hard, it's very hard for us to really get going spiritually because the age is very heavy and materialistic. So by chanting this word Krishna, because it does indicate the beauty of God, the all-attractive features. And Rama, grammatically in Sanskrit, Rama means the source of pleasure. So therefore this chanting is very pleasurable, and it helps us to become attracted to God. Otherwise, if you sincerely follow Jesus or sincerely follow Muhammad or whatever, you'll certainly get spiritual benefit. Or if you understand that there is a Divine Mother and you sincerely try to worship that Divine Mother, there's also benefit in that, of course. But it's the theology of the Bhagavad Gita that ultimately that feature of God, because God manifests in so many ways, millions of ways, throughout the world and throughout many other worlds. But that ultimately Krishna is the original, most attractive feature of God, although he manifests in different ways.
But is that most attractiveness, is that a personal standpoint from you, or is that...
That's Krishna's own claim. That's it's a very old tradition, way back thousands of years, and there's a very, very developed and even sophisticated theology which has manifested around the person of Krishna. It's a very, just now actually coming to light in the Western world. It's a very, very advanced theological religious tradition, and that is the understanding that's always been there about Krishna, even when he was on the earth. Those who loved him, those who knew him, understood him in that way. Perhaps in the last 10 minutes I could ask Jahiri to give out these cookies. We have restaurants all over the world, and a lot of people like our food, even they don't like us. And so we made some nice cookies for you. They're all natural. Jahiri is quite fanatical about natural ingredients and the environment and all that. So she's going to get this. Anyway, also, before you leave, we have some other books if you're interested you can look at. So any other questions?
When you were telling the story about Arjuna, about Arjuna and Krishna and the war, what is the stance now on war? Is war just to overcome evil? Is war something that is a duty or an obligation to happen in society? What is the motto?
I would say war is really only justified to overcome evil, not as an instrument of state policy, not to satisfy the greed of politicians to get more territory, or because of ethnic cleansing or whatever.
Do Krishna people get involved in politics per se?
Not so much. I mean, as we all know, the politics nowadays is quite polluted. But we're not adverse to it in the sense that if, first of all, let's say if a member of our organization, by becoming involved in politics, could do good to the world, then that might be a good reason. Not so that individual could become famous or get money or power. That would be considered to be a really bad reason to get involved in politics.
Oh, I agree. That's why I'm concerned why there's not more religious sects or religious-minded people, and maybe not so much religion like, I don't want to say the religious right type sect, but the people that truly believe in good and resting evil are not involved in politics.
A very good friend of mine is involved, but he's in the southeast United States. He once ran for mayor of Atlanta. Didn't do too bad. Another friend of mine once almost got elected state representative in Florida, but I think in the future something will have to do eventually. But I think when we do it, we can't be hypocrites, and we can't, well, that says no, we can't be hypocrites. We actually have to be true to our principles.
I was wondering if that would just be the most visible exercise of your belief, to
I think
those
yeah.
positive things.
I think what you said is very good. I mean, I think it would be a very good thing to do, and take it as a good suggestion.
I wanted to go back to what you said about names, because I think that's very powerful. In Islam, the tradition you mentioned today, there is the tradition of the 99 names of Allah, and Allah being the supreme name of God. And especially the Sufis have a technique where they chant the different names of God, such as Al-Amin, the trustworthy, which is also a name for Muhammad, the prophet. And it seems that in the belief of the Muslims that the very saying of the name of God in some sense is invoking the presence. Or it's in the Quran that if you take one step toward Allah, He'll take 2 steps towards you.
Right.
Would you say that is your belief also?
Yes, the same idea.
Yeah.
That God is actually present in His name. It's not just a reference to something. It actually is God.
So desecrating the sacred name is also a real negative, because I guess it's like, well, the sacred goddess of speech, Vaj.
Right.
I mean, in some sense, having sound or speech is, well, it's a vibration. It's coming from eternity, and its desecration is a really downer.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
I was wondering how they view evil. Does it reside as a quality or
Evil.
Yeah, does it reside as a quality or is it an entity or said something?
It's an interesting question. Evil is, of course, it becomes embodied in activities, and the cause of it is illusion or ignorance. And yet people are responsible for the evil that's performed. So it is, you could say it's a quality. For example, this gets into some topics raised by Hume, which I probably can't get into too much here, but let's say someone commits a crime. Let's say they kill an innocent person, for example. And so we would say that, of course, it's an evil act. The act itself is evil, and that it actually has an evil quality. Sometimes, for example, if you're around evil people, you can actually feel, we use modern terms like bad vibrations or whatever, but it is something you can practically perceive. So there is a quality, I would say, yes, which attaches itself to acts, to certain states of consciousness.
They don't see a dualistic quality like the Judeo-Christian religion, where they see the devil as being sort of like the polar opposite of God or anything.
Well, in our conception, God is not simply the supreme being, He's an absolute being, which means no one can really oppose God. I mean, God may allow you to go out and scream your head off that there's no God. But God's allowing you to do that. There's no power. There's no personality who can operate without the sanction of God. All the power comes from God. And so there's no independent power, autonomous power, apart from God.
Sanction doesn't necessarily mean approved of here.
Right, it doesn't mean necessarily. Exactly. The idea, though, is that God gives us free will, and so we're responsible for what we do. The problem with evil, of course, always comes up, why people suffering and so on. That's a problem really only in a religious system which conceived of the self as somehow being the body being resurrected. Whereas in other systems of thought, like classical Greek philosophical thinking as embodied by Plato and Aristotle and, Socrates. Even Aristotle in the Anima, at the end he kind of says, all right, religious soul survives the body. But if you understand there's a soul, which is different from the body's just a covering. Interestingly, you find this also in St. Paul. In the New Testament, there's one statement by Paul that actually don't think you're the body or the soul or something like that. Anyway, but if you are eternal, and if you are a soul, and you're just changing bodies like you change dress, then when you are born in this world, it's not your first life. You weren't just created. You've always existed because you're part of God. God has always existed and you're part of it. And so, on that reading of it, innocent people don't suffer. Innocent people suffer in the sense that in this life they've not visibly done something which warrants that type of suffering they encounter. But that's not their first life. It's actually an eternal person who's had many lives in this world, somehow has pain reactions from previous lives. So therefore in India the problem of evil didn't become such a major theological problem as it did in a religious culture which conceived of the soul as being just created in this life. I think it's more of a problem that comes out of...
So it's more of a karmic thing than the pain?
Yes, yeah, exactly. We still lament suffering. It doesn't mean you don't lament the suffering, but it has to be understood also. Yeah.
Where do these new people keep coming from? Where did they originally come from?
You've got to count all the heads in the whole system, because the system is operating among many millions of species and among millions of planets. It's a very big system.
So the fact that we see an increasing population is not necessarily an error in judgment. It's just a transfer from grasshopper to person.
Exactly. It's just like, let's say, San Luis Obispo County grew. It may be that other counties lost some population or something. So there's a certain amount of souls in the universe, and they go all over the place. Yeah, exactly.
So you wouldn't challenge the idea of evolution?
We would challenge it only in this sense that, first of all, in the literal sense of the term, it's not scientific. Because whenever science people engage in religion bashing, they always trumpet this special feature of science: you can observe things. Now, everyone knows the principle of selection of the fittest, survival of the fittest, that we can observe anywhere. Everyone knows. People have always known that, by the way. It didn't take Darwin. People knew that, thousands of years ago. Anyone that ever, for example, I'm sure people in Greece that were growing olive trees knew that the hardier trees survived. But the idea of evolution, to prove evolution, you'd have to show that a case of one species coming from another. And so, just let us see it. So it's something we can't observe. That's the first problem. And also, we say that life comes from life. That, interestingly, the Darwinism kind of took over from Christianity. There's the same timeline, the Christian concept of time, in the sense that, although in the Greek classical world there was a sense of time moving in cycles, and also in the Vedic system, as the planets move in circles and cycles, the Judeo-Christian idea was a time, first there was nothing, then there's something. It starts on this day at this moment, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, whatever it is, and then it just goes in like a time arrow in one direction. Time moves in one direction, and it just goes from a fixed point, as opposed to the concept of time being eternal and moving in cycles. And so the evolutionists simply took over this whole Christian or Judeo-Christian theory of time and just took God out from the beginning of time and just stuck in some principle like the Big Bang. Everyone knows there's a hierarchy of being. Obviously there's but how does that happen? Is that by God's arrangement, or is it just by mechanical processes? So even if you study thousands of years ago back in ancient civilization, the theory of evolution has always been used as a weapon against theology, as a weapon against the idea that God created the world. We can, for example, give God some sort of emasculated role. Well, maybe God, started evolution or this or that. But if you say that once evolution gets started, it just kind of does its own thing according to the laws of nature, then there's no real significant role for God. You can just let him be like an honorary guy or something. And so for thousands of years, this theory has been used very consciously to take God out of the picture and explain things another way. And that attitude really is there. So we accept there's a hierarchy of being. We accept survival of the fittest. We accept there's certain kinds of natural selection. But the fact that a giraffe comes from some other species or this or that, no one's ever seen it. No one ever will see it because it just doesn't happen. And it's accepted by science not because it's been observed, but because they feel that they got their finger in the dike. That if you take your finger out of the dike, if you let go of Darwinism or neo-Darwinism, whatever, then you open the floodgates to all types of primitive belief in God and soul and things like that.
Well, what about fossil records? That's physical proof right there.
Fossil records, actually there are almost as many anomalies as there are fossils. There's a good book on that just came out called The Forbidden History of the Human Race. And for example, just focusing on the human fossil record, there are virtually as many anomalies as there are fossils that confirm the evidence. This is a new topic, by the way, in social science, a very hot thing, the sociology of knowledge, the way knowledge is filtered out. Good empirical data that doesn't confirm the ruling paradigm is filtered out, it's repressed, it's rejected. And so if you look at all the data, it's a very different picture. Anyway, thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Swamiji for coming to the class. It's really enlightening.
Krishna Keshava, Krishna Keshava, Krishna Keshava, Pahima. Jaya Prabhu Para, Jaya Prabhu Para, Prabhu Para, Jaya Prabhu Para. Jaya Prabhu Para, Prabhu Para, Prabhu Para, Jaya Prabhu Para. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Tattakyan Arik Shloke Panchatatter Vyakyan. The next two verses describe the truth of Advaita Prabhu, and the following verse describes the Pancha Tattva, the Lord, His plenary portion, His incarnation, His energies, and His devotees. Ei Choda Shloke Kori Mangalacharan Tahi Madhye Kohi Shaba Vastu Nirupan. These 14 verses therefore offer auspicious invocation and describe the supreme truth. Sab Srota Vaishnavere Kori Namaskar Esab Slokir Kori Artha Vichar. I offer my obeisances to all my Vaishnav readers as I begin to explain the intricacies of all these verses. Sakal Vaishnav Shuna Kori Ekman Chaitanya Krishna Shastra Mata Nirupan. I request all my Vaishnav readers to read and hear with rapt attention this narration of Sri Krishna Chaitanya as inculcated in the revealed scriptures. Purport. Lord Chaitanya is the absolute truth, Krishna himself. This is substantiated by evidence from the authentic spiritual scriptures. Sometimes people accept a man as God on the basis of their whimsical sentiments and without reference to the revealed scriptures. But the author of Chaitanya Charitamrita proves all his statements by citing the Shastras. Thus he establishes that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Krishna Guru Bhakta Shakti Avatar Prakash Krishna Echa Rupe Korena Vilas. Lord Chaitanya enjoys by manifesting himself as the spiritual master, the devotees, the diverse energies, the incarnations, and the plenary portions. They are all 6 in one. Icha Etater Kori Charan Bandhan Pratame Samanye Kori Mangalacharan. I therefore worship the lotus feet of these 6 diversities of the one truth by invoking their benedictions. Vande Guru Nisha Bhaktan Isham Ishavatarakan Tat Prakashams Jatat Shakti Krishna Chaitanya Sangyakam. I offer my respectful obeisances unto the spiritual masters, the devotees of the Lord, the Lord's incarnations, His plenary portions, His energies, and the primeval Lord Himself, Sri Krishna Chaitanya. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Krishna Das Kaviraj Goswami has composed this Sanskrit verse for the beginning of his book, and now he will explain it in detail. So all that came before, the first 33 verses, are a type of built-in introduction. He offers his respectful obeisances to the 6 principles of the Absolute Truth. Gurun is plural in number, because anyone who gives spiritual instructions based on the revealed scriptures is accepted as a spiritual master. Although others give help in showing the way to beginners, the guru who first initiates one with the Maha Mantra is to be known as the initiator, and the saints who give instructions for progressive advancement in Krishna consciousness are called instructing spiritual masters. The initiating and instructing spiritual masters are equal and identical manifestations of Krishna, although they have different dealings. Their function is to guide the conditioned souls back home, back to Godhead. Therefore, Krishna Das Kaviraj Goswami accepted Nityananda Prabhu and the 6 Goswamis in the category of Guru. Isha Bhaktan refers to the devotees of the Lord like Sri Srivas and all other such followers who are the energy of the Lord and are qualitatively non-different from him. Isha Avatarakan refers to Acharyas like Advaita Prabhu, who is an avatar of the Lord. Tat Prakashan indicates the direct manifestations of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the direct manifestation, Nityananda Prabhu, and the initiating spiritual master. Tat Shakti refers to the spiritual energy, Shaktis of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Gadadhara, Damodar, and Jagadana